Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel, video channel on YouTube and podcast channel. I wanted to mention again that on the podcasts, there are 2 Lydia McGrew channels because we had to start a new one due to a technical glitch in November. So the content from November 2024 on is on a different podcast from the content prior to that in audio only. In the videos on YouTube, it's continuous. This is the first video of the new year of 2025. What I've decided to do for the first few videos here of 2025 is a short series on non-biblical literature and the literary device method of approaching historical literature. And this sounds kind of dusty, but there's a reason for it. It's really actually very important. This is material that I deal with at greater length in The Mirror or the Mask, otherwise known as TMOM. So I'm going to include a link to Amazon for TMOM in the show notes because I'm hoping that people will delve into it there. There's a tendency for people to accept the idea that the gospel authors are deliberately changing some facts in their stories because they're told, and one of the chief people who's telling people this is Dr. Michael Licona, but he's not by any means the only one. Craig Keener says some of this as well. Craig Evans very much so says it, though he doesn't go into as much detail in arguing for it as Dr. Licona does. They're told by some fellow Christians who are scholars that, well, we find this stuff, these changes in non-biblical literature. And so we know that these type of devices existed at the time and would have just been understood by everybody. That's another very sweeping claim. Not that they would have been understood on a case-by-case basis, but that just everybody would have understood that this kind of thing might be done in a document that they were reading or hearing read, even if it presented itself as historical. So the analogy would be if you go to a movie that is based on true events, even if you don't know which individual things are changed, since you know it's just a movie based on true events, you know that some things can be changed. Now, that still means that its reliability is very dubious, and they don't confront that. They seem to want to take the word reliable to mean, hey, somehow this is all okay, which isn't what the word should mean. But laymen tend to feel that, oh, okay, I have to accept that the gospel authors were doing this once they've been told that outside the Bible, these changes were common and it was understood that these changes would be made, because that's supposed to be some kind of independent confirmation. And not only laymen, I think there are scholars who have accepted that for that reason as well, because there's this specious, fake impression that you have a convergence between critical scholarship of the Gospels, where critical scholars have claimed for a long time that there are these contradictions in the Gospels that can't be resolved by traditional harmonization, and these literary device claims where it's being claimed that this was done outside the Gospels and that these were existing devices that were just accepted. And then it's like, ooh, those two things come together. Now I can explain what the critical scholars are seeing in the Gospels by these devices and, sort of keep a hold of your evangelical membership card while not going up against the guild of New Testament scholarship and New Testament criticism. In fact, the appearance of independence there is completely phony because these so-called devices are actually being found, quote unquote, in the Gospels precisely by grabbing the places where the critical scholars say there's been some change and then claiming that that's a device, not by independently sort of shutting your eyes and saying, here I have this independently verified list of devices, and now I'm going to come over here to the Gospels, and I can look right in there and I can see that independently verified device here in a way that has nothing to do with the fact that critical scholars claim there was a change. It's just the opposite. It's pasting post-it notes on critical scholarly changes and calling them devices, sometimes when you don't even claim to have a name for it, or something coming from outside literature. So the claim of independent verification in non-biblical literature is playing a huge role here, and it's not a justified role. I want to read a quote here. This is something I did back in 2020 in my series of responses to Dr. Lacona's responses to The Mirror or the Mask. If you're interested in a series of shorter videos, more slickly produced, slick in a good sense, on these topics, you should go find my 2020 series, and I'll try to link to a playlist that has those. I think there were 7 or 8, so Lacona response video series, part 1, part 2, part 3, and you might find that a good lead into this topic. Or if you just are listening to or watching what I'm doing now in 2024, this will cover some of the same material, though in a less smooth way. So here's a quotation from Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, which was Dr. Lacona's 2017 book. There are many observations of differences in the pericopes in the Gospels that follow, for which potential devices are neither described in the compositional textbooks nor observed being employed by Plutarch. We will keep in mind that many of the compositional devices in use by Plutarch are likewise not found in the compositional textbooks, nor are they taught in any of the ancient literature that has survived. Accordingly, much of what an ancient author did and why he did it will remain in the realm of informed guesswork for modern historians. Now, I've argued that the claim to find these devices in the compositional textbooks is completely wrong as well. It's like a deep misunderstanding and misreading of what are just curriculum exercises of a sort that any teacher is familiar with, and not in any way giving historiographical advice that if these students grow up to be historians, they can change this. And sometimes these are so blatant, these misunderstandings are so blatant, like saying that there was a literary device of inflection, of changing the number of people involved in a situation and adding people who weren't even there. And you read the passage in the textbook and it's just having students inflect nouns and verbs for practice writing in the dual and plural and singular in Greek. So it's got nothing to do whatsoever with changing facts in writing history. The misunderstanding is very deep. But this quotation goes beyond that. It admits that even accepting that reading of the compositional textbook as giving compositional devices for changing stuff in historical writing, there are more so-called devices that are being claimed that aren't found listed anywhere. There is no claim of a list. So instead what they're doing is they're going to, say, Plutarch or some other author, and they're doing what I call discrepancy hunting. This is a very bad method. So you find differences between, say, 2 of Plutarch's lives, or between Plutarch and somebody else, or between Sallust and Cicero, and then you just leap to the conclusion that not only are these differences contradictions, which is a question in itself, but they're actually arising from deliberate change, and moreover, that deliberate change is a kind of known device that you haven't found listed anywhere else, but it's just this device that people felt they were allowed to do. And you're getting all of that just from comparing 2 ancient authors and finding a difference between them and then leaping to this conclusion. It's a terrible method. So looking at non-biblical literature takes the whole question of inerrancy or fundamentalism out of the discussion, because nobody Nobody claims that Plutarch is inerrant, okay? You're not a fundamentalist if you think that Plutarch didn't, in fact, make an error in a certain place, or that Sallust didn't deliberately change some fact, Sallust being a historian. And it allows us to look directly at the methodology by which these devices are supposedly being observed. We observe Plutarch doing this. We find this in Plutarch, and showing that that methodology is deeply, deeply flawed because it's overlooking common sense explanations of differences in historical documents and jumping to pointless, elaborate literary explanations of mere differences. I have a flowchart in The Mirror or the Mask that emphasizes this by showing other possibilities that are not being taken properly into account in this discrepancy hunting method. So, is this difference a result of a contradiction? That's the first question. Is there any even contradiction here, or is it just a difference? And we'll see an illustration of this in the example I'm going to give a little bit later in this video. Remember that contrary to the rhetoric that this makes contradictions melt away, it's not true. The compositional device view actually fixes contradictions in place. So an example would be claiming that John moved the temple cleansing. That's not making the so-called contradiction between John and the synoptics on when Jesus cleansed the temple melt away. In fact, it's insisting that there is a discrepancy there because it won't make sense to say that John moved it if you say that Jesus actually cleansed the temple twice. Then nobody's moving anything. To say that John moved it, you have to say that there was just one temple cleansing, and the synoptics and John are in conflict with one another if you take them to be literally historical. So there is a contradiction on the literal historical level, but then saying somehow that's all right because he did it on purpose. So if you change something on purpose, that's not supposed to be a problem, and we'll just call it a compositional device. And now everybody feels better about this, but it's still a contradiction. If you harmonize them, for example, if you say, as I would argue, that Jesus did cleanse the temple twice and that that's not far-fetched at all, then there's no device. Okay, there's no device because there's no conflict in the first place. So that's the first thing that's being skipped. Is there even a contradiction? Is there even an actual discrepancy between these accounts in this case, non-biblical literature? Then is this a result of deliberate change? Remember, in order for something to be a compositional device, it has to be something that the author did deliberately. Or is it a good faith error, which is a far more natural explanation, I would argue. And I'll be giving an example of that next time. And again, nobody's an inerrantist about Plutarch or Sallust. So we need to consider that more reasonably. Is this perhaps non-deliberate? Okay, and then, is this propaganda or deception? Did the author mean for his readers to take him seriously on the literal historical level? This is very important because you will find classicists saying, so-and-so changed this to make this historical figure appear this way. In the case of Josephus, to sort of, retcon his own life to make his earlier actions appear less upsetting to the Romans. And that's an example I'll be dealing with a little bit in this history. That's my plan. Where that change is pointless if it's not accepted as history by the audience. All right, propaganda isn't a compositional device. If you want people to really believe something about somebody, if you want to make somebody look more dangerous than he was, or less dangerous than he really was, or more likable than he really was, and you want to change that in your history to influence people, then that's propaganda. That's not a compositional device. And that's a point that again and again and again just gets overlooked completely in this discrepancy hunting method. So today I'm going to talk about anti-harmonization as it applies to Plutarch, and I'm going to give one concrete example. There are many more examples that I go into in detail in Tima, the mirror or the mask. For this video, I'm just going to do one. So here is a supposed transferal. This is fact-changing transferal carried out by Plutarch, and this is supposed to be an example of how we find or we observe Plutarch doing this. Okay? Here's a quotation from Dr. Licona about Plutarch. I'm going to just say the name. This is going to be Caesar. This is Plutarch's Life of Caesar. Okay. In Caesar 32, Scipio introduced a motion that Caesar be declared a public enemy if he did not disarm by a certain date. In Caesar 33, Lentulus the consul said there was a need for arms against a bandit. In Pompey 58:4, Marcellus called Caesar a bandit and urged that he be declared a public enemy if he refused to lay down his arms. Plutarch appears to conflate the logia uttered against Caesar by Scipio and Lentulus and transfer them to Marcellus. So, quick little bit of background. This is about a time when Julius Caesar was at odds with the Senate of Rome, and he wouldn't give up his army. And so there was a concern that he was going to, set himself up as a dictator, which the Roman people were supposedly not supposed to have. Okay, Rome was supposed to be a republic. So the Senate was very unhappy with Caesar. And these sections of Plutarch in his 3 different of his lives of the noble Greeks and Romans that Dr. Licona is summarizing here are about a meeting, probably the same meeting, of the Roman Senate, where they're saying, what are we going to do about Caesar? What are we going to do about Julius Caesar? Because he won't give up his army. Okay, and he's out there. We think he's too powerful. Okay, and in one of these, Scipio, one of the politicians, introduces a motion. We're familiar with the notion of introducing a motion from our own politics, right? That Caesar would be declared a public enemy if he doesn't disarm by a certain date. In the same life, the life of Caesar, Lentulus, another politician, in that same meeting, says, we've got to take up arms against a bandit or a highway robber, okay? Which he was calling Caesar. When you go to it's second, so it's 3 passages or little sections out of 2 lives. You go to the life of Pompey. There's a guy named Marcellus, and he calls Caesar a highway robber or a bandit, apparently in the same meeting, and he urges that he be declared a public enemy if he refuses to lay down his arms. So the conclusion, which Dr. Licona gets from a classicist named Christopher Pelling, who uses this faulty discrepancy hunting method quite a bit and has influenced Dr. Licona, is that Plutarch is deliberately making Marcellus say 2 things that he has no reason to think Marcellus said, presumably Marcellus didn't say them, that were actually said by 2 other people. And so the word logia just means sayings, so it adds a specious air of technicality and expertise here. Let's just call them statements or content or something, and that Plutarch is deliberately taking things that were actually said by Scipio and Lentulus, he's combining them, and he's attributing them to a third guy, Marcellus, who didn't really say them. Okay? One of the most interesting things, and I point this out in Tima, Licona does not even suggest any particular reason, either literary or thematic, for Plutarch to make Scipio and Lentulus say certain things in one life and to make Marcellus say them in a different life. Different life meaning different one of Plutarch's documents. The alleged devices appear to be random and pointless. Is Plutarch supposed to have made these deliberate changes merely for the sake of variety? And that will happen sometimes. You'll have somebody say, oh, Tacitus moved this trial because of moral reasons. What moral reasons? They don't even describe a moral reason, and you can't even think of one because they've become so quick to just say somebody changed this on purpose. Sometimes they don't even bother to make up a alleged reason, and the alleged reasons are usually completely subjective and far-fetched when they do make them up. So what's more plausible here? All right. It needs to be understood that in these passages, in Plutarch, in Caesar, and in Pompey, we don't have like lengthy speeches by Scipio and Lentulus and Marcellus spelled out, in like direct quotation where there is some kind of super uncanny resemblance. Okay, that might make a better case for an actual contradiction between the life of Caesar and the life of Pompey. Instead, we have summaries in just like a sentence of what these guys said. And I give the passages in TMOM. So look that up if you want to see it. From Plutarch. Okay, so these are summaries. And the summary is that what motion Scipio introduced. We might do that in describing a debate in the Senate. This guy introduced a motion that we pass a law that has this effect, okay, that Caesar be declared a public enemy if he didn't disarm by a certain date. Then, again, brief statement, well, we need to take up arms against a bandit, all right, and because there was a suggestion of some kind of compromise with Caesar, and some of the senators were mad about that. They were like, he's out there with an army. We don't, basically what we might say, no bargaining with terrorists, right? We're not going to bargain with him. We should just give him an ultimatum. Get rid of your army. You're not supposed to be marching on Rome with an army. You're not supposed to be seizing power for yourself. This country is governed by, a government of laws, not of men. This is a republic. We're not going to bargain with you, okay? And Marcellus says that same kind of thing in Pompey. We need to take up our own arms against a bandit or a highway robber, and if he won't lay down his arms and give up his army by a certain date, he should be declared a public enemy. Now, what do we know about how political bodies work? And it's very clear in Plutarch that the Roman Senate does work this way, okay? This isn't some kind of anachronistic porting something back. They debate things. They're a public body that makes resolutions and laws and so forth. One guy introduces a motion or an idea, this is what we ought to do, and another guy says, I think we ought to do that, right? I mean, they agree, right? So concerning declaring him a public enemy, Scipio introduces a motion, and in Pompey, Marcellus is endorsing that same motion. That's not an indication of a change of Plutarch shifting something from Scipio to Marcellus. That's just that Marcellus is supporting this thing, okay? And we find out from Caesar, the life of Caesar, that it was introduced by Scipio. Very, very normal. You can call that a harmonization if you want, and maybe I would call it a harmonization, but it's such an easy natural harmonization that no discrepancy should have been suspected in the first place. Now, similarly, just because someone calls Caesar, hey, he's acting like a bandit or he's acting like a highway robber, that by itself doesn't mean that, they couldn't both have done that. Plutarch seems to be moving this logion to Marcellus. Why would you think that? Have you ever heard of talking points? How many times in our own political debates does someone refer to a politician they dislike by a negative epithet? During the last election, I saw signs all over in my neighborhood referring to a certain political candidate as a dictator. We heard that a lot. And I'm not saying this because I'm a fan of that political figure. I'm just pointing out that calling him a dictator or saying he was a threat to democracy, he's going to set himself up as a dictator, isn't some kind of logion that's only uttered by one guy in a given session of a political body. And then if you find someone saying that a different guy in that same session called that political leader or that person by that same epithet, somebody must have moved it from one to another. No, it's a talking point of the opponents of the public figure. And similarly here, calling Caesar a highway robber is apparently a talking point. In fact, Marcellus might have heard Lentulus say that and might have thought, well, yeah, that's a great way to describe it, and picked up on it because they're all there in this session. So there's not even an apparent contradiction. And what is happening here is that Dr. Pelling and Dr. Licona are picking up on this difference, this that doesn't even appear to be a contradiction, refusing to say the common sense thing about it, that, yeah, all of these things happen. It's the Roman Senate, okay? Somebody introduces something, somebody agrees with it, somebody insults Caesar in a certain way, somebody else thinks that's a great way to insult Caesar and insults Caesar in the same way. They don't even do that. They leap over all of that to the conclusion that this is a compositional device that we observe in Plutarch, okay, and we're going to call it transferal. We're going to give it a name now. We're turning it into a thing, and then say that that's the kind of thing that then the gospel authors consider themselves like licensed to do, which is changing something from one person to another when they know that that person didn't even say it. And let me emphasize too that there isn't even any notion here that Marcellus was acting as an agent for Scipio or Lentulus. Sometimes the distinction is blurred between fact-changing and non-fact-changing transferal, so that if I say I'm building a house and I've hired a contractor to build that house, and you know that I'm not suited by my qualifications to actually build a house, we're transferring in a non-fact-changing way. Okay, there's no problem. I'm building a house is an understood thing, figure of speech for commissioning someone else to do it. But they're not even claiming that Scipio and Lentulus commissioned Marcellus to say these things in their place, but just that Plutarch, for no reason even suggested, just said, hey, I'm going to put those two sayings together and I'm going to say that Marcellus said them, okay, when he didn't really say them. And now we have an instance that we observe in Plutarch of transferal, and now we're going to say that's an established device. We're going to apply it to the Gospels because we've somehow established it in an independent way. Well, that supposed independent way is a deeply, deeply flawed methodology. And I'm starting today to show that by showing how the discrepancy hunting method causes these scholars to skip very reasonable harmonizations, in fact, so reasonable that no discrepancy should have even been suggested in the first place. Next time, I'm going to talk about good faith error in non-biblical history, so that you can see how that is being skipped as well as an option and continue to understand more about the flawed nature of this method. So please come back next time, like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.